Welcome, Denise Arola here, Associate Director for Office for Education Policy, and I am here with another video on value-added growth because we have new questions this year. The reason we have new questions this year is because it's our second year of Atlas, and there's some important differences between Atlas and ACT Aspire that have led to some confusion. And this video is about uncovering the mystery behind those confusing value-added growth scores. What is the confusion, you might be asking? The confusion is around when the change in the Atlas scores, the scale scores for Atlas, don't always make sense with the student's growth score. And we're going to uncover why that might be the case. And you can see here some examples of questions I've gotten or statements folks have made and said, I don't get it. Well, let's figure it out together. I did a 3-part series digging into Arkansas's growth model, and this is from part 1, but I thought it was a very helpful slide because it points out that growth and achievement can take different forms. It requires at least 2 achievement scores or 2 points in time, and in large-scale assessment, which is what a state summative is, growth and achievement can mean many different things depending on your test and the methods that you're using. To explain some of what you're seeing that's confusing you, we need to talk about 2 things. We need to talk about the score scale, the properties of that, because we have a different score scale for Atlas than we had for ACT Aspire. And we'll talk a little bit more, but we're going to talk vertical versus horizontal or within year scores. And then we're going to talk about how do we go across the test changes from an ACT Aspire to the Atlas. And that's going to bring us into talking about score history and current year score. So many of you that go into LEA Insights are in a module that was built in 2019. And it was built in 2019 when we had 3 years of ACT Aspire scores. And we visualize the model using that vertical scale. So you can see that as the student increases in grade level, the scale score goes up from the bottom left to the top right. And we would talk about the difference between what we expected versus more than expected and less than expected. But we have to pay attention to the properties of our new assessment to understand things better. Let's take a look at the vertical scale of the ACT Aspire. The ACT Aspire, reading on the left, math on the right, 2 really good illustrations. You can see the ready cut is the black dashed line. That is the expectation to be ready for college and to be successful in college and career ready courses. And then you can see that it increases in increments, mostly almost in a linear way from left to right. Lower at grade 3, higher at grade 10. Then you can see the solid blue line, which is how students actually do. And you can see that that line starts to depart from the ready cut, and the dashed blue line kind of smooths it, so you can see that growth in the early grades is at a greater rate than growth in the middle grades, which is at a greater rate than growth in the upper grades. And you see that as we look at the smooth lines in both of these. But in both of these, it's really easy to see that relationship because it's on a vertical scale. And that makes it a little more intuitive, but we can still uncover what's confusing and get you some clarity. Let's contrast the prior ACT Aspire with the current Atlas scale score. What you see here are the cut points for each of the performance levels. Again, this is a criterion referenced assessment, and we chose to have a criterion referenced within grade scale for this because the main purpose of the Atlas assessment is to tell you how students are doing relative to those performance level descriptors on their grade level standards. And that's a different definition of a different purpose than what we were using the ACT Aspire for. Now, you can see that the 1060 is the same. That was by design. You can also see that there are slight up and down differences by a point or 2 at the most in terms of the level 1-2 cut, which is at the blue line, and the level 3-4 cut, which is the purple line. And you can see, for example, that the level 3-4 cut is a little bit lower for 8th algebra and geometry compared to 76543 in grade 3, whereas the level 1-2 cut is a little bit higher for algebra and geometry. Now that's going to play into whether or not a student meets expected growth relative to their scale score and their performance level, which is, I think, where some of this confusion is coming in. Well, let's look at what it looks like for students on average in the state across this within grade scale. So these are the mean scale scores in 2024, which is the purple line, and 2025, which is the green line. And one of the first things that jumps out is that it's flat. It goes straight across. It doesn't go up from a low point at grade 3 to a high point at grade 8. Now, that's not a problem because it's designed to tell you about how students are doing relative to the criterion of the standards in their grade level. So what we would hope to see with the Atlas scores is that instead of, on average, the state being below the 1,060, we would like to see this flat line, flattish line, increase over time. And when I say increase, I mean the entire line lift up and get above that 1,060 at all grade levels, because we've chosen that as our mark for proficiency. Now, because of that, 1,060 and 1,061 from one grade level to the next may not be the same as it is in another grade level and subject. So this is where some of the confusion can come in, because it's intended to be interpreted relative to the performance levels. Now, I circled algebra and geometry because you can see that on average, students are doing less. The mean is actually lower in algebra and geometry than it is in some of the other grades for math. And that also plays into helping you make sense of the value-added scores that you see later. What does student progress look like within grade? It's hard to tell unless we turn it into a standardized score, because we are going across two different tests. Some of your confusion is because you're seeing an ACT Aspire score in 2023 and then two Atlas scores for 2024 and 2025. It's hard to imagine, how are those comparable? Well, they're only comparable if we put them on a standard scale. So that's what we do. We create the Z-scores. And because of that, take a look at these three charts. What I'm illustrating here is how different every student's history is. On the left, the very left-hand chart, are students starting out well below. And you can see their progress over time. They are really splitting into different score histories. Each of those students has their own score history, and we want their expectation for growth to be based on where they've been. That's how we control for all the things that you can't control for in your school. In the middle chart, we have a set of students starting out right near the middle. And you can see that their score histories go all over the place. They spread out. Some kids go up, some kids stay level, some kids go down and then go back up. It varies. And the same is true for our students at the very right-hand chart, where they're starting out at a higher level. And again, students are progressing differently over time. So we need a model that takes those differences into consideration. Now, I've shared these in my Digging Deeper series, and I encourage you to go dig deeper with those videos. But we know that students start in different places and that they grow at different rates. That's what you were seeing in the prior slide. Those were Arkansas students. So if students, in fact, start at different places, we want a growth model to account for that. When growth models don't account for different starts, then it reduces the fairness of the model, and it holds people accountable for things they can't control. Notice that's on the chart on the left. You can see these different starting points. And this is how the starting points would average, but we don't use that average. Over here, you see students growing at different rates. And again, in some models, you hit that average rate and expect all students to hold that. Well, that ends up being not reality and not as fair. So what do we do? So if our students start at different places and grow at different rates, We want to count for this in our expectation for the student. That's why we use their score history. Our model allows for different starting points and it allows for the rates of growth to vary. That means we are not forcing students to an average or a predetermined criterion to show growth. Now that's different from the idea of achievement, which in our Atlas test, it is about a predetermined set of criteria related to grade level proficiency. Accounting for differences in student score histories is what makes our growth model fair. This is important because we know about the relationship between achievement and students' economic disadvantage status. We know that the correlation is a negative 0.3, which is a moderate correlation in the opposite direction. So students who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds tend to have lower achievement. Now, when you aggregate that to the school level, we're looking at a negative 0.60. So achievement is negatively correlated. The higher the achievement, the lower the school poverty rate, or the higher the poverty rate, the lower the achievement. That's what this relationship tells us. Let's contrast that with value-added growth. What our model does is actually make it a fair playing field. The student value-added growth correlates at almost zero, negative 0.07. So it's effectively no correlation to a student's economic status. So every student starts out on a level playing field. Every student gets an estimated expected performance that's based on their unique history and rate of growth, and this makes it fair. School growth, once you aggregate that up to a school statistic, that correlates at a negative 0.19. And the growth of the lowest quarter of students correlates at 0.03. So you can see that even at the school level, the relationship compared to achievement is much reduced, which means that if you're growing students, that shows up in your growth metric. And I would say, after having been in LEA Insights and looking at some of the scores, that most of your growth scores make sense relative to the changes in scale scores of the student. What's difficult is it's hard to know exactly how much change in a scale score is necessary to meet growth. And so that's what I want to show you here. Given that we are switching from a vertical scale, how would you understand the growth score changes and the scale score changes to make sense of them? To do that, we use a standardized score, a Z-score. Let's take just a minute to unpack this slide. This is an example of how a student score history and their current grade or subject impact their expected scores and their growth. And I've intentionally brought some examples that have confused some folks on LEA Insights. So here we have a math student, and their progress, their Z-score, their standardized score, is illustrated in the solid blue line. And what you can see is their Z-score. So in 2022, the student was at a 0.18. 0 is the average for all the students in that subject and grade level. And then if they have a positive Z-score, they're higher than the average. If they have a negative Z-score, they're lower than the average. We get all of the student scores and we standardize them for each year on grade level and subject. So you can see where a student is relative to the average. But what we're doing is we're using that in the score history. So take a look at this student from 2022 to 2023. They were on a test where they went from a 179 to a 194. So they increased in their points. Their Z-score is a little bit higher, 0.73. But then in 2024, this student dropped in terms of their Z-score. So they took the Atlas assessment, they scored 1,039, and compared to all the other kids that year for that subject and that grade, the student was at a negative Z-score. And then the student in 2025 was still at a negative Z-score. That dashed blue line is important. That shows you where the student was expected to be on the Z-score. So that's our expected change in score. Where this comes in to be really important is It shows you what was being expected of the student and how the student did against those expectations. But where it becomes really important is over here under 2025. You can see that this student was at a negative z-score of 0.35, negative 0.35. They had a scale score of 1,049. Now, some of you might be saying, wait a minute, they gained 10 points. 10 points on the Atlas scale. Why is their growth a negative 0.04? Well, now they're very close to expectation. They were expected to get a z-score of a negative 0.30. So those 10 scale score points were very, very close in getting the student to have met growth. But they weren't enough, and the reason is in their score history. They started out as a high-performing student. Look at where they were in 2022 and 2023. So in order for them to really be growing as much as expected, they need to start getting back on that upper trajectory. So this adjusts for that low year in 2024, but it also sets a growth expectation that is a little bit more ambitious because this is a student that needs to get back to higher performance. So this is one example, and I'm going to talk through a few more. Again, the solid blue line is the student's actual z-score, and in parentheses you see their scaled score, and then the dotted line is what we expected them to be doing based on their score history. So you can see this was a student that started out above average, stayed slightly above average, and then their first Atlas score was 1,088. That was a z-score of 1.35. So that means the student was more than a standard deviation above the average student at that grade level that year. That's really, really good. So based on the first 2 years, their expected score, they'd been relatively flat. So the expected score had actually given them just a slight uptick. So they were expected to get a 0.89 and they got a 1.35. So the model's not going to go crazy and just use that one high score. We're going to use the whole history that says this student started out growing moderately, had another decent year, but we're going to moderate that by how the student did over the whole history. So when you look at the 2025 score, you can see the student had a z-score of positive 1.12, which is down from their z-score before. They also have a scale score of 1,077, which is down from their scale score of 1,088. Now, what you don't see on here, because I forgot to label it, is that this is a higher grade level. So looks like the student has had an ACT Aspire since 2022. So this would be at least a 6th grade student. And what we know is that as we get to 6th grade, the amount of change starts to slow down. And so we want our model to account for that overall. And so that 2025 score becomes really, really important. So this student lost, 11 scale score points, but actually met their growth. And that is because the model is taking into consideration that between 5th grade and 6th grade math, there's kind of a little slowdown for students. The rate of change is not as much. And so we need to account for that and set a realistic expectation. Now, if you're just looking at the scale scores in LEA Insights, I guarantee you're looking at this and going, huh? But when you take into consideration the history, the fact that it's also conditioned by the first 2 years, you're getting a realistic expectation for the student, and the student is actually meeting that expectation. That is where you can make sense of some of these numbers that don't make sense to you. I'm going to go through a few more examples before I wrap this up. This is another math score, and by the look of the scale scores, I would say this is a 4th grade student because they have scale scores in 22 and 23 that appear to be on the MAPS, NWEA MAPS scale. And you can see that this is a student that started out below average. So they had above average, but this is a student that started out with a positive z-score, 0.03, but not super positive, kind of right there in the middle. And they had a a scale score for the MAPS of a 176. That shifted the next year into a 182, which is not really a whole lot of progress on that scale. And then when they took the Atlas for the first time in 2024, they really dropped. They dropped down to a 1,040, and they have a negative Z-score. Now, the model is going to look at all three of those historical scores and say, where do we expect this student to be? This student gained 8 scale score points. 2025, they went from 1,040 to 1,048. They went from I can't read it, it looks like a negative 0.75 in their Z-score to a negative 0.40. Well, their expectation was a negative 0.41 because, again, we're starting to pull them back up because of this dip. And their growth was actually positive because overall the student was starting to make a comeback on their scores. Here we have a student that had really up and down history. There are not a lot of kids like this, but there are kids like this. This student started out well below on a Z-score, or her Z-score, a negative 1.16. And they were, this looks again like a fourth grader, not 1,060, 160. They bumped up to 184, which is close to the average, and then they dropped again. So they dropped all the way down to almost a negative 3. They got 1,000 on the Atlas, which is the floor of the Atlas in 3rd grade. So they were actually expected to get a higher score than that because of how they had been performing. But when you take into consideration all 3 years and you look at this student, in 2025, they had a negative Z of 2.05. They needed to get to a negative 1.94 Z-score. They made an 18 scale score increase on Atlas, but it wasn't enough because of where the student had been. This student was expected to be higher or to start to recover from that 1,000. Now, it looks like all they needed was 1 or 2 more points, but this student has a slightly negative growth score because they didn't recover enough. Hopefully, what you've learned from this is when things get confusing, consider the following. We're now living in horizontal score scale, which means within year. So the interpretation of those scores is first and foremost designed to be about criterion, the grade level standards and how well a student is demonstrating proficiency on the grade level standards. And then second, it's also when we standardize those scores to calculate across the test changes, we're looking at the full score history, which unfortunately you can't see in LEA Insights. And we're also looking at how are kids doing in that current year score. So 7th grade algebra, 8th grade algebra, great examples because the test, it's more rigorous cuts. And so students may not meet their growth. Or they might meet their growth with a lower score and it still makes sense. So when in doubt, it's about the Z-scores. And if you don't know what they are, then my hope is that DESE will build those in next year to a revamped LEA Insights module. Stay tuned. We're going to host a town hall to discuss growth scores and answer your questions. The time and date is still to be determined. In the meantime, if you still wonder about the growth scores, there are so many resources out there. DESE has a bunch of resources that have just been released or are about to be released, and you can find those on their website. And then we also have some resources for very specific questions that come in that we want to be helpful in answering. So, and also, if our team is here at OEP to support you, so just reach out to us through oep@uark.edu or find us on Facebook and let us know you'd like some help. Also coming, I have promised to do a quicker video on the bottom quartile, and that's coming soon.